We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build the decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast.
Hey everybody, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. A lot of folks in microgrids and distributed energy are feeling down right now. Changes in federal policy are not going their way. But my guest today is going to tell you, despite what's happening in Washington, or maybe even in a weird way because of it, we're entering a very good time for this field. Tim Hade is well known and well respected as a co-founder of Scale Microgrid. And now he's off on a new journey, which he's going to talk about. It starts with his home community of Santa Barbara, California, but its implications nationwide. If you're worried about the state of distributed energy right now, and I know a lot of people are, this conversation will make you feel a lot better. Here we go. Hey, Tim Hade, I am so happy to have you on the Energy Changemakers podcast today.
Well, I'm so happy to be here. And as you know, but I will tell all of your listeners, I am one of your biggest fans. And I've learned so much from your writing and your podcasts and your general participation in the energy industry for as long as I've been doing this over the past 15, 20 years. So it's an honor to be here with you today and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I have to tell you, you are a co-founder of Scale Microgrid. When I read that you had stepped back from the company, I got really worried. I said, oh my God, we can't lose Tim Hade. But I was really happy to hear we have not lost Tim Hade, and you're up to some really interesting things that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
Fantastic. We need you. We really need you. So one of the things I find really interesting is that you live in Santa Barbara, and a lot of people love Santa Barbara. It's a great place to live, but you moved there for a very specific reason. Talk about that.
I guess at the high level, I moved to Santa Barbara because Santa Barbara, in my opinion, has the worst electric grid in the continental United States. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for distributed energy resources to play a big role in helping to fix that. And so, look, I think maybe to take a step back, and you know this, and I know this from being around the block a few times. But what I think one of the big challenges that we've historically had in the distributed energy space is that we're not really solving a problem that people prioritize, right? And so, if you go back 10 years and you think about the era that we were in, sort of circa 2015, there was no load growth, and electricity in the United States was generally cheap, abundant, and reliable. And so, every time we built a distributed energy system, we were adding value perhaps to the specific off-taker that we were building the system for. But for the grid as a whole, we weren't really adding a ton of value. And so the question that, I became obsessed with, right, is how do you go find the places that have the biggest challenges and utilize the technology that we're good at building to help people solve those problems? And I think there's a really, really cool opportunity to do that in Santa Barbara. And so that's what I'm spending most of my time on right now, is trying to sort of make distributed energy resources happen on a community level, not just at an individual off-taker level. And I don't know, it's a fascinating process that we can talk more about.
Well, I have to tell you that I'm envisioning some, real estate folks who are listening to this, jotting down notes. Positive point for Santa Barbara, bad transmission system. I'm sure you're the only person in the world who would move to Santa Barbara for that reason.
It's funny. I've been here for 3 years now. And, I think ultimately, and this is, I think, a key disclaimer, right, is the reason that Santa Barbara's electricity system is so challenged really has nothing to do with our utility, which is SCE, or anything that anyone who currently works at SCE has done in their careers. When the power system was being built in Santa Barbara 100 years ago, the utility company at the time wanted to run a transmission line on the beach, and the residents of Santa Barbara were having none of that. And so we made the utility run the transmission system behind the mountain. And so right now, Southern Santa Barbara County, which is the end of the line for SCE, is fed by a single set of transmission lines that runs through 40 miles of high threat wildfire district and mountainous terrain. And so it creates a real resilience challenge for the community. And then on top of that, we have all the normal challenges associated with being at the end of the line, right? Voltage sag and things of that nature. So, we have resilience challenges, we have reliability challenges. When FEMA was still doing this, Santa Barbara County is in the 99th percentile of all counties in the country with respect to natural disaster risk. And so we're dealing with climate change, and we're on the front lines of climate change in a very real way. And so you kind of put all those things together. And, I think in a weird way, the electricity system is like a kitchen table conversation for a lot of folks in the Santa Barbara community. And so when that's the case, and when these problems get elevated to that level, it presents an opportunity for people to come in with solutions and make things better. And I think distributed energy is going to play a huge role in doing that in Santa Barbara. And so I'm very excited about what we're going to do here. And then, the potential for the model to scale elsewhere, right? I think ultimately distributed energy is a community resource. It's not just for individual off-takers who can afford a system. It's really about making the system better for everyone. And as an industry, we haven't really been focused on that yet, but I think that's the next step in our journey.
Tell us a little bit about what this solution is that you're working on, because it's really pretty different from what you have traditionally done in terms of DERs. Is that right?
Yeah. So I guess my career in the distributed energy industry has really spanned two companies. The first company I worked at was a company called Energy Redox, which was a cogeneration company. And when I was there, I really spent most of my time building 1 to 5 megawatt cogeneration projects. So, industrial off-takers, a few colleges, universities, things like that. Then I started Scale in 2015 with my best friend, Ryan Goodman, who's still my best friend. The idea there was really that the technological evolution was really favoring batteries and solar as sort of the key component of distributed energy systems, or the foundation, if you will, of distributed energy systems. And so, we built Scale into what it is today, which is a provider of commercial and industrial microgrid technology. And they do a lot of other stuff too, but that's sort of the core of the business. And so really just focusing on those commercial and industrial off-takers. And so, look, I think what's really interesting about the next evolution of our industry is that it's really not about a single technology. It's about a value proposition. And so, again, I'll talk about this through the lens of Santa Barbara. But if you talk to most people in Santa Barbara, right, what they want is more reliable, more resilient, cheaper, safer electricity. How you get that to them, they're pretty indifferent, right? With the exception of the fact that, we live in a community that's very aware of climate change. And the preference of almost everyone is to do this in the most sustainable way possible. But how you get it done isn't as important as getting it done. And so, look, at a community level, I think, the key insight for people in this industry is that the value proposition isn't about a single technology, right? It's not about a commercial industrial microgrid, or whether you're building utility scale batteries or behind the meter batteries, or, you have a smart thermostat program or whatever the case might be. Like, those are all tactics. But the strategy overall, right, is how do you get all of these different technologies deployed in the right places on the grid so that in aggregate, the value proposition they're delivering to society is a lot greater than the cost of building out those assets. So a simple way to think about that is aggregation is the key to the future of this industry. And, again, there are a lot of companies out there, that strategy, right, is generally referred to as virtual power plants. There are a lot of folks out there that are kind of working on components of a broader virtual power plant strategy. But I don't really think there's been an organization that's been able to sort of tie all those parts together in an optimal way yet. And so, that's what I'm taking a crack at, right? I'm trying to figure out, how do you get residential solar companies and the utility and commercial entities and software providers and all these different folks with their own agenda to, collectively work on a system that benefits the community. And, I think we're making a ton of progress, and it remains to be seen if we're going to pull that off, but I'm pretty optimistic about it.
So how do you do that? What's the secret?
I think there's a lot of very complex technical answers to this, but I think the foundation is really community organizing. And so, one of the first and smartest things I've ever done is right after I moved to Santa Barbara, I convinced my friend Leah Stokes, who's a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and sort of an expert in the political science aspects of distributed energy and the energy transition, to help me think through this. And what I've learned a lot about over the last 3 years is how you bring a community together. And I think, first of all, local government plays a huge role in these systems, right? I think traditionally in the electricity industry, we've been very dismissive of local government, and we focus most of our time at the federal and the state level, because those are the folks that, have grants and incentive programs and control over that kind of stuff. But those aren't the folks that really have relationships with their constituents, right? The folks that have relationships with their constituents are folks on the city council and at the mayor's office, right? And if you think about electricity as infrastructure, which it is, local government is responsible for infrastructure, right? When you are driving down the road and you hit a pothole that's been there for 3 weeks and you're mad about that, you don't call your congressman or your senator, you call your mayor, right? You call the mayor's office.
They're the ones who get called during a power outage too. When the power's out for, several hours or several days, people will call their utility, but they'll also call up their local mayor and city council person. And yeah, they get all the grief.
That's right. And so I think the challenge for a lot of local officials is they don't have the resources that a lot of state government officials or certainly federal officials have, right? Like, my friend Jigger Shaw, one of the things I always joke with him about is one of the reasons that he was able to make so much progress when he was running the loan programs office is because he had, the 19,000 scientists that work at the national labs on call, right? And so he could, if he had a question about, grid enhancing technologies, he could call the smartest people in the world at NREL and get them to explain to him, whether this superconductor tape was better than that superconductor tape or whatever the case might be. But local government officials can't do that, right? And they don't have those types of resources. So I think the biggest challenge for me, right, was trying to meet with those folks and explain the distributed energy landscape and what's possible and how we are able to get it done in a way that kind of resonates with them and then they can bring back to their constituents. And, again, I think that's been a real learning experience for me. It's certainly the first time I've ever tried to organize this many factions at sort of this scale. And Santa Barbara is not a small town. We have about 250,000 people in the area that I'm focused on, but it's small enough that people still have really direct relationships with their local government officials. And so, again, I think we've been able to sort of figure that out. It's been a lot of trial and error in terms of trying to get folks up the learning curve with distributed energy, but I think we're pretty close to getting there. And the support from our local government has been enormously positive over the last year or two. And a lot of the progress we've made is a direct result of those relationships.
And you had a conference recently, correct, in Santa Barbara about these issues?
Yeah, we hosted an event about 2 weeks ago called the Santa Barbara Energy and Resilience Summit. And look, I think the main idea behind that conference was we got to get our mojo back, right? I think everyone in our industry to some extent has gone through kind of a grieving period over the past 6 months, right? Regardless of what you think about broader political issues, as the distributed energy industry, we generally felt really good about the direction things were heading under the Biden administration, right? Specifically with Secretary Granholm and Undersecretary Crane and Jigger and some of the other folks that were running programs at the Department of Energy. It seemed like we really had a good plan and path forward to kind of accomplish our dreams. And then the election in November happened. And I think a lot of people kind of went in the tank, right? And just assumed that, because we no longer have the support or the resources that we were counting on from the federal government, that we weren't going to be able to do these things. And I disagree with that conclusion. We could talk about this a little bit later, but I think this is really the moment for distributed energy because of a lot of macro factors. And there are definitely headwinds, but there are also tailwinds. And so the main purpose of the Santa Barbara Energy Resilience Summit was just getting everyone who's active in the local ecosystem together to remind them that there is still a path forward and we can still accomplish everything we set out to accomplish. But then look, I think the secondary mission of getting everyone together was, certainly here in Santa Barbara, we do not have the most efficient system for building things. There's a lot of local permits and there's a lot of county permits and there's a lot of state permits. And sometimes those things directly contradict each other, right? And so ultimately, and this is no surprise to anyone who's been working in the distributed energy industry, we have a soft cost problem in our industry where projects that we should be building for $2 a watt cost $4 a watt. And the reason for that is bureaucracy. And so part of the way that you cut that down is you get everyone together and you build a circle of chairs and you sit down and you say, hey, I want to build this project, but it has to make economic sense for the off taker and it has to be able to deliver value to the grid. And in order to be able to accomplish both of those things, I have to be able to build it for X price. In order to build it for X price, right, I need to cut my permitting budget from $300,000 to $100,000. And here are some things that you could do as a mayor or a city council person or a county supervisor or a state regulator, right, to help me get there. And look, I think the really cool thing, and this is happening all over the country, is that pretty much everyone is aligned on what should happen, right? We want to build a lot of renewable energy. We need to build a lot of storage to complement that renewable energy. We know that we need to enhance grid flexibility or demand side flexibility in order to do that. And we need to be able to do that in the most sustainable, economically viable way possible, right? So there's like a good amount of alignment on what we're trying to accomplish. I think really where the rubber hits the road is how do you do that? And there's different answers for different places, but it all starts with getting everyone in a room together and making sure that we understand that working together is the path forward.
Yeah, that's great. That's tremendous. You don't see that enough. So often just project developers come in and they just want to develop a project and they sort of have blinders on. And then they get sort of confused about why the community opposes it. But your approach is totally different. This is our project. This is a community project. This is all of us figuring out how to solve this together, which is just very, very, very cool. But it seems to me that there's still kind of a big problem, right? And that is that, and you brought this up already, the federal government can provide funding to get these things at least started, right? But local governments don't usually have the money to do this. I know there's been a little bit of work done in Santa Barbara. I think there was a microgrid or solar storage projects in the schools and EVs, if I remember correctly. But really to do this in a big way, the way it needs to be done, requires money, right? So where can that money come from?
So look, I think at a high level, the way I would think about this is money in and of itself is not the problem, right? I mean, there's trillions of dollars of private sector capital sitting on Wall Street right now looking for a home. Utilities have money and states have money. So, I don't think money in and of itself is the problem. I think there are a lot of business model problems that our industry faces, right? Look, at the end of the day, my take on this is that people are willing to do things that help their community. And so I've built a lot of commercial and industrial microgrid projects. And, ultimately, I think economics are a huge driver of why people adopt these technologies. But, it's more than that. And I think if you can explain to people why them being a host site for a microgrid or a distributed energy system or something like that not only benefits their bottom line, but also benefits the community that they live in, that's a really powerful message and people want to be a part of that, right?
Yeah.
And so, that to me is kind of the key to unlocking this is businesses, especially local businesses, want to be a part of helping their community and sort of helping the folks in their communities overcome their own challenges. And so if you could package that in a way where there's some economic value for the off-taker, but there's also a lot of community benefit, then people are willing to take less good deal terms in order to make those projects happen. And so ultimately, our problem as an industry is really a return problem, not a capital problem, in the sense that there's a lot of capital that wants to invest in these projects, but for the most part, they want low to mid-teens returns on that money. And when you try to build these projects in a way that generates low to mid-teens returns, especially with the uncertainty around the ITC and everything that's happening at the federal government, it's really hard to balance the equation and deliver economic value to the off-taker and also meet the requirements that the investment community has. And so I think there are a few different ways around that, right? One is as this technology gets more broadly applied and a lot of the kinks get worked out, our cost of capital is and should be going down. But there's also, alternative funding structures. One of the things I'm really interested in right now, we can talk more about this, is utilities have cheap money, right? And so, is there a way to sort of get utilities to fund a bunch of the distributed energy resources that are being deployed in the community? I think there are pilots that are happening right now that indicate the answer to that is probably yes. And so ultimately for us as an industry, the key to thinking about this is realistically, we're going to have to be able to build these projects at an 8 to 10% return, not a 13 to 15% return if we're going to achieve mainstream penetration. And, again, I think that there's a path forward both to convincing private sector investors that those type of investments are viable, and at the same time, maybe bringing in outside capital sources or non-traditional capital sources for the distributed energy industry to try to help bridge that gap, right? And so that's really the key, at least the way I think about it.
So one of those approaches that's being looked at, a lot of people are talking about now, is the distributed capacity procurement model that
Yeah.
Spark Fund has put forward. And I know a lot of various utilities are looking at that, and Spark Fund is working with them. Have you brought that idea to Santa Barbara? Could that work there?
Yeah.
And also maybe tell our listeners too what it is. A lot of people don't yet know what distributed capacity procurement is.
Yeah. So the basic thesis, right, is that utilities should be able to invest in distributed energy resources because in a lot of cases, they're the entity best positioned to both understand where distributed energy resources are going to have the biggest impact on the grid overall. And then also that they, in certain cases, can be the right entity to invest low cost capital in those projects. And for those of you who I guess are maybe newer to this industry, the United States basically has 2 or 3 different electrical systems, but there's a regulated market and a deregulated market. And where most of the innovation has traditionally happened is in the deregulated markets. The problem with deregulated markets is that utilities are prevented by regulation from investing in generation resources, right? So rooftop solar and storage have traditionally been considered generation resources. And so utilities haven't been able to do anything sort of behind the meter or front of the meter, close to the meter, right? Because of these regulatory restrictions. I think there has been an evolution in the regulatory regime where folks now see battery storage not as a generation asset, which it's not, but as a distribution asset, which opens the door for utilities to be able to invest in batteries. And, that's basically the thesis of distributed capacity procurement, right? Is that the utility goes out and they run a process where they invite, various distributed energy companies to come in, and they'll say something like, on this distribution node, we need to reduce our peak demand by 10 megawatts. And they'll accept all sorts of proposals from various companies about how they can reduce peak demand by 10 megawatts. And then they'll pick the one that best serves their needs. They'll fund that project with ratepayer money. And then, the distributed energy company will build and execute that project on the utility's behalf. And I'm really interested in the business model, right? I think it's still new, right? So I think Spark Fund is still kind of at the, pilot stage where they haven't, they've done a ton of work, but they haven't necessarily done this at utility scale yet. Let's put it that way. They're working on their first projects in that realm right now. But look, I think it's a business model that has a ton of potential, right? And ultimately, if that's the key to making distributed energy resources get deployed a lot more quickly, I think it's an option that has to be worth consideration. And that's what we're doing here in Santa Barbara is we're taking a hard look at it, and we're talking to SCE, and we're talking to our local government officials, and we're talking to the folks at the CPUC, and we're trying to figure out if, that's a viable option for making our goals occur a lot faster than they're currently occurring.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. It seems like it offers a lot of opportunity to create some scale here. Of course, at the same time, so those of us who have watched utilities for years, and you brought this up, we get a little bit nervous because they've been known not to be innovative. And as you said, it's partly because they're sort of in a situation where it's difficult for them to be innovative. But it also kind of is a cultural thing, I think, with utilities. Their job, right, is to keep the lights on. I mean, that's their mission, and they get sanctioned if they don't do that. So they are understandably cautious. So I'm going to be really curious to see if they can sort of balance out that caution. And also, I guess my fear would be that the independent side, the non-utility side, has always been the innovative side. And I guess my concern would be that if they start doing business so closely with utilities, will that innovation be curbed?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I have all the same questions, right? So I don't know what the outcome's going to be, right? It's definitely a sea change, right, that's happening. But look, I think one of the things that I really believe is that necessity is the mother of innovation, right? And so I think the biggest thing that has changed for utilities over the past 5 years is load growth. And so, again, if you go back 10 years, right, like we were in a period of 3 decades of stagnant growth in the electricity sector. And so I think a lot of the reasons that utilities didn't innovate is because it wasn't in their best interest to innovate because the status quo was the most profitable model. We're not in that world anymore, right? And so if you think about sort of the intersection of, domestic manufacturing, the electrification of everything, but specifically vehicles, and then whatever is going to happen in sort of the hyperscale data center sector, which is still being driven primarily by cloud compute. But I think increasingly people are convinced that these AI growth projections are not a fallacy, but are real. We're in a period of load growth that we haven't seen since the end of World War II. That's the last time in American history that we saw the amount of electric load growth that we're currently projecting. And so, look, I think utilities are now in a situation where rates can't go up any more than they're currently going up, right? So I think the current statistic is like 1 in 6 Americans is behind on their utility bills. Utility rates are outpacing inflation in basically every market in the country. In certain markets like California, they're triple the rate of inflation. And so the question is that utilities are facing is how do we keep up with load growth without raising rates? And that forces them to be innovative. And so I think a big part of the reason that these conversations are happening is because utilities no longer have a choice to ignore distributed energy. They know that they have to incorporate distributed energy if they're going to figure out how to satisfy load growth in the most affordable possible way. And that's what most utility CEOs are thinking about right now, right? Is
Yeah.
how do we keep rates down, satisfy load growth, and maintain reliability? And I don't know, you don't have to think about it that long to realize that distributed energy has to play a huge role in that. And so I think, my bet, right, is not that utilities kind of changed out of the good of their heart. They changed because the environment changed. And I think now a lot of utilities are a lot more open to having these conversations. Now, look, the other point that you brought up is incredibly relevant and important, which is utilities do not have a culture of innovation, right? This is not a good or a bad thing. It's just the reality is that, being a good utility employee over the past 3 decades has primarily meant that you do a good job maintaining the status quo. And that has changed very, very quickly, right? I think really it's been the last 18 months since ChatGPT became commercialized that people have really understood what impact hyperscale data centers are going to have on the grid and what that's going to do for demand and this, that, and the other thing. And so, I think utilities are still kind of trying to reconcile how do we evolve our culture to meet the current moment. And I don't think there's any utility CEO out there that feels like they have it nailed, but they're definitely trying, right? And so I think, that creates an environment where folks like me can go meet with utilities and not feel like they're working against us, but that we're actually trying to solve the same problem. And then, again, right, like we have to do a good job evolving to fit inside the way utilities want to do this, and utilities have to bend a little bit. So there's this process of like getting to know you and compromise that's occurring in a lot of jurisdictions right now. But again, right, ultimately, I think the reason that utilities are going to be big adopters of distributed energy resources is because they don't have another choice. And, they have to do it. And so now it's just a question of how are they going to do it, not what they're going to do.
And the relationship to it has changed, right? Because when there was flat demand, if you wanted to build a microgrid or VPP or whatever in their territory, you were taking away from them. Basically, you're replacing their generation with your generation, right? You're cutting back on their sales. But now the world has changed where it's no longer zero sum. It's, oh my God, I need more energy. Where am I going to get it from? Oh, these DERs are pretty quick to build. They look like the way to go. So rather than competing over some limited resources, DERs are fulfilling a need for the utility.
That's exactly right. Right. And I think, for the folks in our industry, the thing I would say is more important than tax credits or political headwinds or what the president says or any of these things. The fundamental macroeconomic situation that we're in right now of dynamic load growth has never happened before for anyone in the energy industry who's currently working, right? Like if you want to find people who really understand what it's like to work in a high load growth environment in the United States, you have to go talk to people who are in their 70s, who are working at utilities back in the 1970s when commercial air conditioning, that was the last like big driver of real load growth in the country. A little bit of data center stuff with the internet in the mid 90s to mid 2000s. But like for the most part, it was the 1970s when everyone was buying an air conditioner that we saw the last like real load growth that looks kind of like the curve we're seeing today. And so again, no one has any experience with any of this, right? It's just a question of, we know that this is happening. We know we have to be prepared for it. And I think that forces utilities to think outside the box a little bit. And, we've always been outside the box. So I think we're in a good position to sort of say, okay, we have the technology, we have the capabilities to put the cheapest megawatts of power on the grid. And, now it's just a question of how we work together to make sure that happens as quickly as possible. And that those resources are located at nodes of the grid that offer the most strategic value to the utility and their overall goal of satisfying load growth.
So another problem, and you actually alluded to this earlier. Well, you actually told us a story about Santa Barbara where, there was the transmission line was built not in the optimal place because of basically sort of a NIMBY situation that occurred there.
Yep.
And so those kind of things are going on a lot. I mean, sometimes it's NIMBYism, sometimes it's other reasons, sometimes it's, permitting or interconnection or some form of bureaucracy that really will slow down these projects. And we're looking at a situation where we need energy fairly soon. So we're hearing more and more about this notion of the abundance agenda, sort of reforming things, reforming these processes so that they are easier to do. And the things that we really need to build, we do build. Will this current world open that up some more, do you think?
Yes. So look, there's a lot to unpack in that question, right? But I think generally speaking, there are a lot of local and state leaders who understand that they need to stop writing white papers and doing studies and start delivering results for their communities. And, I think that's forcing people to sort of think very, very pragmatically about what are the challenges to building the infrastructure that we need in order to deliver for our communities. And when you actually like look under the hood, a lot of these problems are very easily fixable, right? And so, you start to get in situations where it's like, well, why can't I build this microgrid here to help reduce demand on this circuit by 10 megawatts? And the answer is like a law that was written in 1995 before anyone knew the internet existed, or batteries were a commercial product, or any of these things. And so I do think there's a recognition that we have to be more flexible, certainly at the local level, but definitely, at the state and the federal level as well, with respect to specifically the regulatory burden that we have in the United States electricity system. But yeah, look, I think like the overall sort of mood in many, many communities right now is we have to get things done. And if there are first principle reasons that we can't get things done, like, we need a fusion reactor and that doesn't exist yet, then, you got to work on trying to solve those problems. But a lot of times, like the reason that you can't get these projects done isn't because the technology doesn't exist or it's not tested or it's not well understood. It's because like there are a bunch of rules that say you can't do it that were written by people that didn't know this stuff exists. And so, yeah, I think there's like an appetite to make a lot of those changes right now. And I do think that there are a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle who, recognize that, what they're going to be judged on is results and not hyperbole. And so, they're really focused on trying to get things built right now. And I think that's a fun environment to work in, right? It's really fun to meet with local politicians when they say, hey, I want to build your project. Like, what can I do to help out? That's a lot more enjoyable than I think a lot of the conversations we've been having over the past few years. But, you know, again, at the end of the day, the reason for all of this is what constituents are demanding, right? Or are really freaked out about electricity bills, and they're concerned about reliability, and they're concerned about resilience, and they're concerned about climate change. And they want to know what their local, state, federal government is doing to address those problems. And I think our local leaders, certainly here in Santa Barbara, but I think this is, you know, true across the country, or certainly in pockets across the country, are really trying to evolve themselves and, you know, sort of understand that perfect is the enemy of good, and we need to get things done. And not every cost benefit analysis is going to result in zero cost. And again, I think there's like sort of a pragmatic approach that's taking over in a lot of places where pragmatism has not traditionally been the culture.
So between the Trump administration's basically an anti-renewable stance right now, the pressure from that and the pressure from this need to create more energy, all these pressures that are out there right now on the DER industry, it seems like you're telling me there are silver linings. You know, it seems like we're looking at other ways to do things. We're looking at becoming more community focused. We're looking really hard at the kind of bureaucratic things that would slow us down and get in the way. We're trying to become basically more efficient. I mean, it could be that out of this tough time, I think this is what you're telling me, Tim, out of this tough time, we may find some very interesting ways to build easier, build better, get things done.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. And so, look, I think at a high level, right, like the way to think about this is, you know, for the most part, there's bipartisan consensus on the demand side of this equation. So whether you talk to Republicans, or you talk to Democrats, or you talk to people from conservative states, or you talk to people from liberal states, like what everyone agrees on is that like we're going to see a lot of load growth in the next decade, right? And so, and by the way, it's a national security priority to keep up with that load growth, right? So, you know, whether that's, you know, I have conversations with people across the political spectrum, and I think everyone agrees that it's a good idea for America to beat China in the AI race. And I think everyone understands that beating China in the AI race is a function of our ability to power hyperscale data centers and maximize compute, right? Again, this is a little less, I guess, agreed upon, but, you know, people understand that EVs are a real thing, and people like EVs, and they're going to keep buying EVs. And so, you know, we need to be prepared for that. And so I think on the demand side of the equation, and by the way, everyone wants to bring back domestic manufacturing. And so those are kind of the three big drivers of load growth: manufacturing, electrification, and AI. And so like there's bipartisan consensus that over the next, let's call it 5 years, we need to add something like 150 gigawatts of capacity to the grid. Where we disagree is on the supply side, right? And that's where there's like this political divide. And look, I think ultimately the problem that we have right now is the federal government doesn't really have a plan, right? They have rhetoric, and the rhetoric is basically like, we're going to drill a bunch of oil and gas, and that's what's going to help us make as much electricity as we need. And that's just not pragmatic. If you look at like the most optimistic estimates on the gas turbine side of things, we can maybe build 40 gigawatts of natural gas turbines over the next 5 years, right? That's what we can bring to market between all the major players. They just don't have the manufacturing capacity. And for the most part, they're unwilling to make long-term investments in manufacturing capacity in the gas turbine space because all of this is subject to federal political pressures. And so that leaves us 100 gigs short of capacity. The question is, how are you going to fill in that 100 gigawatts of capacity? And what I would argue is that effectively what the Trump administration has done is made it harder to build big things, right? So, you know, the conversation we were having under the previous administration was really about, I don't know, I think what you could generally call an all of the above approach. So we wanted to do that. Sure, there was, you know, the VPP liftoff report, and we want to deploy virtual power plants and demand side resources and all this kind of stuff. But we also want to build nuclear plants and reopen existing nuclear plants and build geothermal plants and offshore wind and onshore wind and utility scale solar and storage and all this type of stuff. And effectively, what the Trump administration has done is made all of that top down stuff, all that big stuff, a lot harder to do. I mean, we're having this conversation, I think, the day the House passed their reconciliation bill, which essentially I think, does away with tax credits, at least if it's in its current form, almost immediately after the bill is passed. And that's bad for the distributed energy industry, for sure. But it's a lot worse for the nuclear industry and the geothermal industry and folks that just can't build projects and can't get capital to build projects without those investment tax credits being in place. And so if you think about this at a very high level, what that means is that we all agree on the demand side of the equation. We need 150 gigawatts. The practical reality is only maybe a third of that in a best case scenario can be provided with traditional natural gas combined cycle turbines. Again, there's this dream of like, we're going to bring coal back, but that's not going to happen. And so at the same time, we've made it a lot harder to build utility scale resources. And so what that means is that like the alternative is bottom up, right? And so in effect, unless you disagree that load growth is going to happen, right? And if you disagree with that, like send me an email and let me know why. But as long as you agree load growth is going to happen, and you also agree that the top down stuff is a lot harder to build, that means that distributed energy resources are a huge part of the answer, probably a bigger part of the answer than they were under the previous administration. And so again, like in the immediate short term, like the next few months, there's going to be a lot of turbulence and there's going to be a lot of recapitalization of companies and projects as we adjust to whatever this reconciliation bill ends up being. But in the medium term, like this is great for distributed energy resources. Might not be great for society as a whole, but it's great for distributed energy resources as an industry because our biggest competitors were geothermal plants and nuclear plants and all these things that the Biden administration was working on trying to commercialize. And that work isn't going to happen. And the alternative to distributed energy resources just got a lot more expensive. By comparison, distributed energy resources are a lot less dependent on federal tax credits as compared to these bigger projects. And so I think, we're in a great position. And then the hope is, right, that over the next, 2-3 years, we as an industry could prove that we can navigate this situation, deploy a lot of resources, work out some of the kinks in our technology, really be ready for prime time. And then, hopefully a more supportive federal government comes into place at some point and we can really like juice this thing. But I'm actually really optimistic that this is a great time for the distributed energy industry for those reasons.
God, that is such a great message and one that so many people need to hear right now. Thank you, Tim. This has been a tremendous conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the Energy Changemakers podcast.
Well, I really appreciate all the work you do. And like I said, I'm a big fan and I would encourage everyone to listen to and read your work because it certainly helped me learn a lot over the years. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. It was a pleasure being with you.
Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.